Our speaker this morning is Dr. Mitch Glaser. He is the president, I guess. Wait, I've lost your bio. I know who you are, but I've got to get it right. He's the president of Chosen People Ministries, which is one of the oldest and largest Messianic missions in the U.S. He did his undergraduate at Northeastern Bible College, did his MDiv at Talbot, and then his PhD work at Fuller Theological Seminary. On Sunday morning, he spoke here at West Houston Bible Church on Isaiah 53. So that will be, that's not, so we number the messages. So number 1 started yesterday, so he was number 0. But it was great. It was great on Isaiah 53, and he has written a book called Isaiah 53 Explained. And so we welcome him. He's going to be speaking on the impact of the Holocaust on Jewish missions this morning. His doctoral dissertation was on Jewish missions in Eastern Europe from 1890 to 1920, right? 1950. And so that is, it's well worth reading if you can get your hands on it, and I have it electronically, so that helps. So Mitch, please come. Thank you for coming and speaking.
Shalom, good morning.
Good morning.
Broken toes. So, this is not an easy, I'm a New Yorker, I'm Jewish, I like telling jokes, but this is not a funny subject. And especially in light of what we've been experiencing. And so, let's just jump in. So, we're going to focus on the Warsaw Ghetto. Why the Warsaw Ghetto? Well, first of all, Jewish people lived in Poland for 800 years before the Nazi occupation. And actually, on the eve of the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939, there were 3.3 million Jews living in Poland. That is more Jewish people than in any other country in Europe, and the percentage was about 10% of the population, just to give you an idea of how large that was. Before World War II, the city, Warsaw, was a major center of Jewish life and culture and religion. Warsaw's pre-war Jewish population was more than 350,000 Jewish people, which was about 1 in 3 of Polish citizens in the capital. So the Warsaw Jewish community was the largest in both Poland and Europe, and was the second largest in the world, second only to my hometown. So Warsaw is a critical part of Jewish history, and the Warsaw Ghetto has been the subject of books, poems, and movies, and is an unforgettable part of the fabric of Jewish history. The Warsaw Ghetto illustrates the impact of the Holocaust on the Messianic Jewish movement, and so what we're going to do is we're going to look at what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto and around the Warsaw Ghetto as sort of a microcosm of what happened to the Jewish community as a result of the Holocaust. We're going to look a little bit before, then we'll look a little bit afterwards. Finally, by way of introduction, what we learned today from our conference already with some of the great papers that we've had is very timely and critical, because the events of October 7th really remind us all too much of the atrocities committed by the Nazis against the Jews during the Holocaust. The events of that day and the rise of anti-Semitism in recent days is all too reminiscent of the 1920s and 30s. I believe those of us in Jewish missions and Christians with a favorable view of Israel will find that her future destiny and the literal nature of prophecy must drive us to take action. We can't just sit and listen. And in fact, we need to lead the way for the rest of the church that may not view scriptures in the same exact way. And so we have a lot of obligation and responsibility. Listen, I'm Jewish. My mother taught me how to make people feel guilty. So you can count on it all throughout. But we need to be driven by the Holy Spirit to take action, to do something. Loved what Paula had to say last night about taking action. And it's very important. I'll also say that I had a tremendous experience in late December and early January. After I had spent a week in Israel, I joined about 90 young people, Jewish and Gentile, messianically inclined young people in Warsaw. Average age was about 23, 24. They came from a dozen different countries, from Israel, Ukraine, Russia, the United States, England, France, you name it. We do this every couple of years. It's a chosen people effort to bring young people together for inspiration, for fellowship, and possible relationships. We have about 11 marriages that have come out of these conferences. And I can even tell you how many children. So it's wonderful when like-minded, like-hearted young men and women find one another. And so we're all a bunch of matchmakers. But it was a very, very serious mood for the conference. My wife has a PhD in Jewish history, and I have mine really in missions, but focused on history. And so she took the first 10 minutes and depressed everybody about anti-Semitism and what was happening. And in light of October 7th, I mean, you know, it was a moving time. And then I kind of lightened it a little bit to talk about actually what God did in the midst of the suffering. And so that's what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to depress you instead of my wife. So just a quick look at pre-Holocaust Europe. You can see the Jewish populations. Lots of Jewish people in Soviet Union, Poland, of course. Ukraine looks covered. And but the question is, was there a real Ukraine at that time? Not really. Czechoslovakia. When I was doing my dissertation, I was trying to find Czechoslovakia before 1918. It didn't exist, just so you know. And so there's been a lot of changes in this area, but in fact, that's what you're looking at, particularly in the mustard-colored portion, is you're looking at a lot of the Pale of Settlement. And the Pale of Settlement was where Jewish people were allowed to live, and there were about 11 million Jewish people living in the Pale of Settlement by World War I. And so if you are Jewish or you know a Jewish person, and don't be shocked if they're from Romania, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, you name it, because that's where we all lived. Those of us who, like Reb Tevye, couldn't get out. My personal journey in trying to understand the impact of the Holocaust on Jewish people and on the gospel work among the Jewish people came when I was a really young believer. And I graduated Bible college and was out at Talbot to go study with Dr. Charles Feinberg. You know who he was? Okay, he was the Pope of dispensationalism at the time. There was a Jewish Pope. A few of them. And so I went out there to study with Dr. Feinberg and actually got him for at least 1 year at Talbot in 1974. Then he retired. But he became a bit of a grandfather mentor to me. And so I was very concerned as time went on as to whether or not my grandparents ever heard the gospel. My mom's parents came from Belarus. My dad's parents came from somewhere in Poland. Unfortunately, I don't know where, because I didn't care as much, and then by the time I cared, they were gone. So I had an important question. Did they ever hear the gospel? Did they ever hear? I'm not going to get into a theological diatribe about hearing as opposed to not hearing, and whether or not God needs missionaries. You've got all that figured out by now, don't you? But I had the question. Just put it this way. If you believe that God doesn't only needs natural revelation for Gentiles and special revelation for Jewish people, God doesn't need missionaries. Still, you got to admit, it's a little easier when someone tells us, right? And that's the marching orders we have, isn't it? And so in Romans 10:14, how will they call on him whom they've not believed? How will they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how will they hear without us? And so I really wanted to know whether or not my grandparents had heard. And so I began studying this whole topic way, way before I ever did a dissertation on it. And it just has been something that has just been driving me for years and years and years. And I get very encouraged by history, you know. I don't know how many of you are Jewish believers, but I know that so many of us, when we got saved, we thought we were the only Jewish believer in the whole world, and that we had actually invented a movement. And then when we discovered you really can be Jewish and believe in Jesus, which I was in the middle of the Jesus movement. I sort of knew that, but it was when I got to Bible college that every day the South African, black, incredibly mature, culturally sensitive believer with a booming voice would greet me every morning coming into class. "Shalom, my Jewish brother." And finally I said, "Caesar, I'm just trying to fit in here, man." Okay? You know, lighten up. Okay, I'm Jewish, but you don't have to broadcast it, you know? And he was a little smarter than me, much more mature. As a minority at the Bible college, he understood how easy it would be for me to sort of subordinate my identity when actually the other brothers and sisters at Bible college needed to know that they were Jews who believed in Jesus because we're part of the remnant. Every Jewish believer you meet is a signpost of God's faithfulness. And he knew that. I didn't know that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the Messianic movement in the midst of all this tragedy. You know, for many years, actually, I believed that there was nothing to study. And a lot of you started your PhD dissertations or a master's thesis thinking that, oh, man, I don't know where I'm going to find the information, but I'm really interested in it. Maybe I'll find something. And of course, by the time I was done with my dissertation, I tried to persuade the head of the PhD department at Fuller that my dissertation needed 2 volumes. Then when he didn't go for that, I said, "What about a smaller font?" He just smiled at me. Dan Cohen-Sherbach, if you've heard of him, he is retired now. And if you know who Richard Harvey is, he was the mentor for his PhD. And so Dan Cohen-Sherbach is more of a liberal Jewish guy, an American living in England. And we became fairly friendly over the years. And he was very favorable towards Jewish people and Jewish believers. He edited a book on Messianic Judaism, you know, and he was very kind about it. And so he wrote in that book, and it's partially true. Following the Holocaust, missions to the Jewish people ceased to function. It ceased to function in those cities where the Jewish population had been largely eliminated. Makes sense. In Warsaw, for example, he writes, only a few hundred Jews survived the war, and most of the workers stationed there escaped before the outbreak of the war, while others died in the Warsaw Ghetto or in one of several concentration camps. He was not far from the truth, as you'll see. So, what do I think about it? I think the answer is yes and no. You can make up your mind afterwards. But my goal in our lectures for the next, I've got one tomorrow too, which will be a bit different, is I want to introduce you to my extended family of Messianic Jews and missionaries to the Jews who lived and some died in the Warsaw Ghetto. I want you to get to know them before you get there. And I want you to hear about their unique testimonies and what they did, what their contributions were to both Jewish life and to the church. These Messianic Jews actually were very unlikely and involuntary heroes and martyrs, for the most part. And I think that standing on their shoulders, and of course you're thinking about the book of Hebrews like I am, Hebrews 11, but standing on their shoulders, I think gives us perseverance and inspiration to face the challenges of our day. And our day is not so different to some degree as it was back then. I hope it doesn't shape up to be more like then than it has now. So sources. Sources are always important when you're doing historical study. For me, the best source was the all of those Jewish mission magazines. So, you know, Paul, keep those articles flowing, man. There's going to be some poor researcher 20 years from now that's going to need material, okay? And so some of us are creating history, some of us are recording history, some of us are writing history, but you know, you need sources. And the British were the best. I mean, they wrote down everything. The Germans were pretty good too. And so I actually hired research assistants to go to the Bodleian Library in Oxford and photocopy literally 1,000 pages of documents from Jewish mission annals, from CMJ, the Anglican mission, which started in 1809, the British Jew Society, which started in the 1840s, and Mildmay mission to the Jews, and so many of the other missions to the Jews. And they make us look young. We're only 130 years old. And as one British Anglican said to me, yeah, you Americans think that's old. And so the Annals of Jewish Mission History is great. I have digitized all of Chosen People Ministries stuff. And I hope to open a portal this year for our 130th anniversary. Sorry, Friends of Israel people, but you are young whippersnappers, you know. And so it's okay. Life in Messiah has a speed. But I hope to do that. We've got all of our Chosen People newsletters from 1895 until today online. So they're all digitized. Along with our founder's son, Joseph Hoffman Cohn, did a lot of radio on these wax cones, is how they did it. So I got some guy to take it from the wax cones and put it and digitize it. That wasn't easy. So the Annals of Jewish Missions, and now something uncomfortable for most of us who are somewhere between evangelical and fundamentalists, right? The Catholic voice was very important. And, you know, I was just raised in the faith a little, you know, I didn't always take the Catholic view into consideration, you know. And it was pretty important, particularly in Poland. And put it this way, you could find a Baptist church in Warsaw, but it's like finding a Baptist church in Jerusalem, which there are almost two. Almost. And 1.5. And so in order to understand what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto, there are a lot of reasons why you have to see some of it through Catholic records. And so I studied that to some degree, but I have a sneaking feeling that I missed half the picture. Because there were some Catholics who were Jewish that I mean, of course I disagree with a lot of their theology, but I mean, in terms of their devotion to Jesus, I can't imagine that they weren't Christians, you know. And it's not what you add, you know, it's what you have. And what you add may not be great, but persecution, by the way, creates very strange bedfellows, just so you know. I'll get to the punchline. Most of the Jewish believers were worshiping in the two Catholic churches that were part of the ghetto. And in one of the ghetto churches, you actually have a plaque honoring the Jewish believers who eventually died, who worshipped in the ghetto. They were not Catholics. There were some Jewish believers who were Catholic, but these were not, a lot of them were not Catholics. They were Jewish believers, but where were they going to go to worship in the Warsaw Ghetto? You'll see, it was impossible. So I'm grateful for a lot of resources. There's a book called Christians in the Warsaw Ghetto, written by Peter Dembowski, who was a historian at the University of Chicago, Polish guy who lived through the ghetto. Actually, when he was a young man, he went to work on the one streetcar that ran right through the middle of the ghetto. And so he tells a lot of great stories about what happened. And then there was also Ludwig Herzfeld, who we'll learn a little bit more about later. Ludwig Herzfeld was a Jewish believer who was a Catholic. He invented blood types. So actually you can find information on him if you like studying medical history, which I never actually knew existed, but then when I found out about Herzfeld, then I started reading some medical history. And he is very, very well known in the medical community, and he's strongly identified as a Jew. And he's an interesting guy. The next person that has a lot of information about Jewish believers is an interesting person, somebody I have great admiration for, who also died in the Warsaw Ghetto, and that's someone by the name of Emanuel Ringenblum. And Emanuel Ringenblum had a PhD in history and was the representative for the Joint Distribution Committee, which was the key social service agency for the Jewish community that was serving people in the ghetto, and once they got out, into displaced persons camps all over Europe. The JDC were really critical. And Ringenblum decided to do a history of the Warsaw Ghetto. And there's actually a little museum in Warsaw called the Ringenblum Museum. And what he did is he got a whole group of people together, and they began writing history of everything that was going on in the ghetto. And they put them into metal milk cans and then buried these huge milk cans. And so far, we've only found 2 of them. And one of the people on the team, they somehow got out of the ghetto because they knew they were going to die, and they needed at least one person who knew where the milk cans were. But we still can't find the 3rd one. And when you piece it all together, you have Ringenblum's history of the Warsaw Ghetto, and you have the diary, and you would think he was a socialist par excellence. I mean, he had no belief in God. He was completely irreligious, and yet he hated the Jewish believers, but not for religious reasons. He thought they were a bunch of sellouts because the only reason they believed in Jesus was to get benefit from the Catholic charities and some of the other charities working in the ghetto, and then eventually afterwards. That happened too. And so there was always this view of Jewish people believing in Jesus because there was something material in it for them. And to this day, it's still an attitude that some Jewish people have. You did it for the money. Sometimes when I would be handing out tracts in New York City, I'd actually have someone come to me and say, you're doing it for the money. And I would look at them and say, you're right. And they'd say, what do you, really? I said, oh, absolutely. I said, I get paid well. He says, I said, you want to know how much? Well, sure. I said, I get $1,000 per convert. I said, really? I said, yeah. I'll make you a deal. If you do, I'll split it with you. Nobody ever went for it. So the Jewish mission agencies were all over Poland and everywhere and we'll look a little more into it in a moment, in Warsaw and Lodz, in Białystok, Krakow. Friends of Israel people, you know that your founder, or sort of founder, did mission work with British Jew Society in Krakow. And you can go to Krakow, and has anybody ever been there? It's neat. It's a neat place because Poland's trying to recapture their Jewish history and show everybody that they really weren't anti-Semitic. And so they've got this whole area called Kazimierz, and you can go to about 15 different restaurants and get Jewish food. And almost in every one of them, they have klezmer groups. And so, you know, they're trying to revitalize it. But Buxbazen was a missionary there. But there were missionaries all over the place. Now, what I'd like to do just for a moment, because I think I can do it better in a video that I did than telling you the story. But I think in order to appreciate all of this, we have to understand a little more about the Warsaw Ghetto. So, a video.
Today, April 19th, we honor those who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. On this day, my Jewish people.
Well, you know, it worked before. No, where's Olivier? He's gone.
Will remember our heroes. The one.
Why would you think this is not working, Robbie? It's a Mac, you know.
I know, so is mine, so I usually. Smart man.
Who bravely faced Nazi brutality to fight for freedom. While many of these courageous souls perished in the battle,
Thank you.
their legacy lives on. They remind us of the resilience and valor of our people and the persecution we've endured and overcome. This memorial is especially meaningful as we recognize how anti-Semitism, especially in North America, is gaining ground and becoming more of a problem than it's ever been for many, many years. We remember to chart a new future for the Jewish people, where anti-Semitism, this oldest hatred, is no longer a problem. Clearly, we still have a long way to go, so it's more important than ever to remember our fallen heroes in this fight against anti-Semitism. The Nazi invasion and the construction of the Warsaw Ghetto came about in a number of different stages. In 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland and within a short time implemented harsh anti-Semitic regulations, leading to the construction of what would become the Warsaw Ghetto. The Nazis also built ghettos in other cities with large populations in Poland, such as Lodz and Vilna. But here are the 4 stages of the development of the Warsaw Ghetto, so you can have this fixed in your mind and understand it better. In the first stage, from October 1939 to November 1940, there was a gradual isolation and gathering of the Jewish population. In the second stage, from November 1940 to July 1942, the Nazis sealed off the Warsaw Ghetto from the other side, the Aryan side, which was only for those who the Nazis deemed racially pure. The third stage, from July 22nd, 1942 to September 15th, 1942, was the resettlement, also called by the German euphemism, the Action. During this time, Jewish people were transported to the Treblinka death camp, where they went straight to the gas chambers. The Action brought about the liquidation of more than 300,000 Jewish people. The fourth and final stage happened between October 1942 and 1943. This point was when the remaining Jewish population in the ghetto instigated a resistance, an uprising. This paragraph from the Teacher's Guide to the Holocaust provides a brief overview of the basic facts regarding the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So during 1942, most of the ghetto residents were deported to Treblinka, leaving about 60,000 Jews in the ghetto. And the revolt took place in April 1943 when the Germans, commanded by a very cruel Jürgen Stroop, attempted to raise the ghetto and deport the remaining inhabitants to Treblinka. The defense forces, commanded by Mordechai Anilevich, included all the Jewish political parties. The bitter fighting lasted 28 days and ended with the destruction, total destruction, of the ghetto. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of Jewish believers in Jesus who perished in the Warsaw Ghetto. We especially want to honor them today. Entire congregations of Messianic Jewish people in Warsaw were destroyed, as we have records of more than a dozen Messianic congregations and fellowships in existence prior to the formation and the ensuing annihilation of the ghetto. We remember martyrs like Basili Yach, who perished in the ghetto. We also think about Rachmiel Friedland, who survived the ghetto and continued to be a light to the Jewish people for decades afterwards. Today is the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. What can we learn from it? This is so important for us. So here are a few lessons. Though some thought the Jewish people were weak, the heroes who died rather than succumb to Nazis proved the opposite. Jewish people are survivors and able to fight for our own lives. I'm Jewish, and those of our families. If it were not true, then how would the modern state of Israel have ever been established? We must always remain vigilant and be aware of how anti-Semitism can become part of a culture and continue to fester unless it's stopped. As we read in Psalm 122, verse 6, we need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and for the peace and safety of Jewish people worldwide. This day reminds us of our holy task to pray for His chosen people. It's important to observe this day so we never forget what happened in Europe 80 years ago. By remembering and collectively saying never again, we hope to prevent another Holocaust.
So can you imagine, I did this just a short time ago, a year or two ago, and lo and behold,
there's one simple vision hack anyone can use to improve vision. So you can say did you know that vision impairments have nothing to do with your eyes? There's simply a camera for the part of the brain responsible for your...
At least it could have been a commercial for Chosen People books.
It could have been, yeah. I'm just going to close that out. You don't need this again, do you?
I just need the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
That.
Now you go back to your PowerPoint, which is where?
Right there.
Right there. And we'll hit your play button. I don't know PowerPoint. I use keyboard.
Oh, you do? Huh? Wow, you're really a Mac guy. Okay.
There you go.
Thank you. So there were a number of Jewish missions that were operating in Poland. The Bethel mission, Danish mission, the Danish Israelite mission, British Society for the Propagation of the Gospel among the Jewish People. That was the British Jewish Society, the Barbican mission, the Hebrew Christian Alliance, CMJ, the Church's Ministry Among the Jews, had Emmanuel Hall. ABMJ, which is Chosen People Ministries, had Warsaw missions. The Mildmay Mission to the Jews had a mission agency. American European Fellowship, they did as well. And this past December, when I was in Warsaw, I looked at one of our old newsletters, and I got the address for our Polish facility. And if you can read it, you can see that Jacob Garfinkel was there. And there have been a few leaders, Jewish believers in Poland, in Warsaw, who were leading that ministry. And so I got the address and discussed it with our team in Poland, and they said it was probably blown up like some of the other Jewish mission headquarters. Almost all of them were destroyed. And I said, well, let's go see the rubble. And so we went over there to see the rubble and found out it was still there. And so what the Polish Chosen People ABMJ staff had was a very large 3 or 4 bedroom apartment in a wonderful little housing development that was in an upscale area, a Jewish area of Warsaw. And we went in, and on the way in met a woman who knew everything about She did urban archaeology. She knew everything about the building and told us where it was. And the strangest thing was there was this Catholic charity, Caritas, that was very, very important in the Holocaust period and kept a lot of the Jewish believers alive who were part of the fellowships that were worshiping at the two Catholic churches in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it was on the floor below where we were. And it was just very odd. And but it was wonderful to see that the Lord had preserved this. Not so good for CMJ, the church's ministry among the Jews. That was destroyed by Nazi bombs. And so, again, just a little bit about the Warsaw Ghetto. Remember the 4 stages? The Nazis were very good at not letting on what was happening. People say, how did they get away with it? Well, they used psychological tricks. They made everybody think everything was okay. It was like boiling the frog in the pot, you know? And you didn't know that you were dead until you couldn't know. And there's the Warsaw Ghetto. There are still remaining walls of the Warsaw Ghetto. And we took all of those 90 young people from all over the place, and we went walking along the Warsaw Ghetto, and we prayed at the walls, and not the Western Wall, but we prayed at the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto. And the very fact, because 75% of these kids were Jewish believers, and just by the very fact that we were alive to see those walls and to pray at those walls, and we had faith in Jesus the Messiah, I can't tell you what it was like, knowing the history, to see that the devil can try so hard and can fail so badly. And again, this is the Warsaw Ghetto, and you can see some of the elements of the ghetto. Just some of the other, you've seen these in the video. The upper right one there is, that's Anilevich, who was the leader of the resistance, refusing to go to Treblinka. There were about 50,000 Jewish people left, and of course they were all killed. Okay, so now let's just address the question. So how many Jewish believers were in the Warsaw Ghetto? Was there a presence? Certainly there was, and they were in 3 major groups: Catholics, Protestants, and Messianic Jews. The low number was about 2,000. The high number was 5,000 or 6,000. But it was probably higher, and I'll tell you why I think it was higher. But Dembowski says that there were probably 5,200 Christians of Jewish origin in the ghetto. He says, because he's Roman Catholic, most of them were Roman Catholic. Probably a lot of them identified in that way. Philip Friedman, a Jewish historian of the Warsaw Ghetto, in his study published in 1957, so it was earlier than Dembowski's, he said that there were 6,000 baptized Jews who were ordered by the Nazis to move into the ghetto, and he adds, where they established their own churches. Wow. So there were Messianic Jews meeting in the Warsaw Ghetto for worship. Todd Endelman, who some of you might know is a well-known Jewish historian, he adds his voice to it. Endelman is obsessed with Jewish believers. And he's a serious Jewish scholar, but he's obsessed. He can't stop talking about Jewish believers. So he proved that though a minority, many thousands of Jewish people converted to Christianity from the late 19th century up until the Warsaw Ghetto. He shows that conversions, especially in Poland, were pervasive through the various, he actually did a study, through the various strata of Jewish life, from the poorest to the wealthiest, and from the common workman to the well-educated. So this is one of the main, University of Michigan, Haber, chair of Jewish studies. It's one of the main Jewish historians. So there's no doubt. Ringelblum says there were. Endelman says there were. Catholic side says they were. How much evidence do we need? So was there a strong presence of Messianic Jews? Yes, there were. I mean, I can only imagine. We have about 800,000 or 900,000 Jewish people in Brooklyn. Okay? If I could gather 5,000 Jewish believers in Brooklyn, that would be a small miracle. No, big miracle. Big miracle. And to think that these Jewish believers were in the Warsaw Ghetto worshiping within those walls is unbelievable to me. Endelman goes on to say that where people were arguing about it, he says, well, if you look at the records, he says, it should be recalled that over 900 conversions in 19th century Warsaw were due just to the missionary work of the militantly Protestant, that's what he used, London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews. Can you imagine an Anglican being militantly Protestant? I don't know. I just don't know about that one. Nothing against Anglicans, you know. It's also interesting that Endelman, in a very important journal article that he wrote, argues with a Polish historian who is Catholic and was doubting some of these things. So Endelman wrote, no critic has ever suggested that this guy, Chininski, fabricated cases of conversion or the details. In fact, the problem is the opposite. The number of conversions in Warsaw were greater than the number recorded. In addition to those he omitted inadvertently due to defective records. Now let me explain that. We're very unused to this, and I don't know if the state of Texas could get away with this. But for those Jewish people who wanted to become Christians, they could become Christians. Once baptized, they had to re-register their religion with the state. And this was true in Hungary, Poland, all throughout Eastern and West, even in Western Europe, and Germany as well. So prior to the Holocaust, there were much better records for historians to study the numbers of Jews who became believers in Jesus because their baptisms were registered. And so all he is saying is that the registries were defective. And those then Endelman says, and those he was paid to omit, talking about this Polish scholar, historian. In other words, he's insinuating that he was bought off by either the Jewish community or the Polish community, I don't know who did it, but he was paid to omit them. It seems that he also did not include those baptized by Anglican missionaries. Now, of course, I feel very resentful here because Chosen People did have a good ministry there, and we're not accused of anything. Also, Endelman writes, third and last, denominational choice also underscores the pragmatic nature of conversions in 19th century Warsaw. Contrary to expectation, most Jews who became Christians did not become Roman Catholics. In fact, only 39% became Catholics. The same percentage as became Calvinists. The reason is Poland had a very strong Reformed church. And the only Protestant church that was on the edge of the ghetto was a Reformed church, which is still active today. And I have visited that church. I got to meet the church historian. Can you imagine a church historian for a local church? And he came down and met and talked with us for an hour and a half about the role of that church and the role of the Protestant Jewish believers. And I said, wow, that's amazing. I said, and then as we were leaving, I looked at him, and there was this picture of this, this guy overseeing the conference room, And I said, who's he? He said, oh, that was one of our Jewish believers. I said, oh. So there was a strong number of Jewish believers who did not identify with Catholicism, identified as Protestants, but were not part of the Jewish mission movement, which is where the Messianic Jews were. So he continues, the remaining 22% were baptized as Lutherans. In the last decades of the century, converting Jews was even less likely to become Catholics. Listen to this. In the 1820s, 79% of converts chose Catholicism. In the next decade, only 47%, but toward the end of the century, it was only 16% of Catholics chose Catholicism. 24% in the 1890s, 24% later on. And I'll give you one of the reasons for it. This is my guess. Because the Jewish missions were not established in Warsaw until the latter half of the 19th century. And so there was a non-Catholic place for these Jewish people who were seeking Jesus to go and worship. That is my opinion. So the story of the growth of the Messianic movement in Europe during the first third of the 20th century leads us to believe that there were many Jewish believers entering the ghetto. So if there were a lot of Jewish believers in Warsaw and the Nazis created the Warsaw Ghetto, then there would have been a bunch of Jewish believers in the Warsaw Ghetto. So let's take these are the two churches, St. Mary's Church and All Saints Church. You can go visit there. But I wanted to give you some numbers. So in the early 1930s, Sir Leon Levison, who was the president of the International Hebrew Christian Alliance, wrote regarding the number of Jews who were coming to the Lord in the 20th century. Now, he wrote this in 1930. So he's only talking about the first third of the 20th century. So 97,000 in Hungary alone. There are whole articles in Jewish journals, and there's a book called Apostasy Today, and Jonathan Sarna edited that book, a well-known Jewish believer, and Todd Endelman did this chapter on Hungary. So there were 97,000 Jewish believers in Hungary alone. The debate is, were they authentic? Or did they do it for the money? Or did they do it so they could overcome what was called the numerus clausus, which meant that only a certain number Jews could be in a vocation or could go to college and so on. So there were a lot of restrictions on Jewish life. So did the Jewish people, quote unquote, convert for the sake of getting a better job or getting a better life and so on? And a lot of people would argue that that was the case. And you would think that the Jewish community would argue that that was the case, and there was a lot of those arguments. One day I was doing my research, and I woke up and sort of to the whole idea that I had bought the Jewish community's line. And I was looking at the number of Jews coming to Christ during this period, and I was thinking very Jewishly, which for me is easy, But I was thinking very Jewishly, and I accepted the cynicism of the Jewish community about the authenticity of the faith of Jewish believers. But when I started reading their testimonies, and we're going to look at incredible heroes tomorrow as in the next lecture, you tell me after I get through with you whether or not these guys are authentic or not. And so I don't buy it anymore at all. I think that they were authentic. 17,000 in Vienna. Boy, what a story. But I can't tell it now. 35,000 in Poland, 60,000 in Bolshevik Russia. Don't you like the way Levison describes it? But Jews were turning to Christ in Germany, Sweden, Denmark, and even America, according to them, had 20,000 Jewish believers. So these figures are really quite staggering. I want to read one more number, and this is from the main missions magazine of the evangelical church at that time, called the International Review of Missions. And it's a very important. It's not quite the Christianity today of that day because it was mostly focused on missions. And listen to this. And this is written a decade after this. Now, if he wrote in 1930, then this is 1940. Okay? And I'll show you why this is important. The work of various denominations for the Jews is also having its effect. More than 100,000 Jews in Eastern Europe since the war, World War I, have entered the Christian church. Excuse me? 100,000? And it's possible that they were shooting low. While political influences in these lands have doubtless played an important part in the conversions reported, due recognition must also be given to the preparatory work of Christian teachers and evangelists whose self-denying service opened a way for the public acknowledgement of a change of faith. Sometimes we think the everyday missionary work, which sometimes does not bring great immediate satisfaction because Jewish people, like me, are not that too quick to accept Jesus as our Messiah. But what the IRM is saying is that decades and decades of faithful missionary work in places like Poland, which were huge Jewish communities and very insular, that actually the gospel eventually did break through to large numbers of people. Then he says, in other lands, especially in the West, many Jews dissatisfied with Judaism are finding their answer to the deepest longings in the faith in Christ, at least 20,000 Jews. So here's a little report after the Holocaust, or as it was beginning. This again, now I'm going back 10 years, or not 10 years, but probably 5 years, for these reports. Not the International Review of Missions to Jews, but other reports of what was known then as the International Missionary Council Christian approach to the Jews, which was something like, you're familiar with the Lausanne Consultation on Jewish Evangelism. It was a group like that. It was a broad group of Christians who were interested in Jewish missions. So here's what they wrote. There was an article at one of their meetings. Thousands of executions are reported. Hundreds of thousands are in concentration camps and compulsory labor camps. 3.5 million Jews are exposed to the worst vindictiveness of the Nazis. 200,000 more from all parts of the Reich from a terrible ghetto at Lublin, where destruction and plague form a terrible ghetto at Lublin because the Nazis were importing German Jews and French Jews and others to, of course, places in Poland. Then listen to this. Many native missionaries have been cut off by the war, and the work of all British societies has stopped. The Danish mission in Lvov has been brought to an end. It's not known whether the American Board of Missions to the Jews is still able to work. We were not. Some missionaries from the small Baltic states are also among the refugees. All the missionary activities in German territories formerly carried on by the British Society have been presumed coming to an end. Extensive work in Poland has been suspended, including that of CMJ, the British Society, the Miami Mission, and the Barbican Mission. The Warsaw facility of CMJ was also destroyed by the Nazis in a bombing raid. 4 bombs fell on the premises of the CMJ facility in Warsaw, and it was destroyed. Reverend Allison, who was leading the work and was a missionary in Lvov, escaped to Romania just before the Russian entry, and no organized work is being carried out there as well. Within the vast sea of humanity, one believer wrote, actually it was, you'll meet him tomorrow, it was Jacob Yach. Within the vast sea of humanity, where the majority of the approximately 5,200 non-Aryan Christians who were in the ghetto, Victor Wiseman and his family were among those as well, and he was a member and leader in the Hebrew Christian congregation from the Emmanuel Church. That was the CMJ, Messianic congregation, that was meeting in Warsaw in the place that you saw that was destroyed. Additionally, there are those associated with the Roman Catholic churches in the ghetto, especially All Saints, and other Jewish Christians, including Nathan Sendek, formerly head of the Mildmay mission to the Jews, who was killed. And so on and on and on. There was incredible loss and destruction. One more word. The work of the Bethel mission in Lodz suffered terribly. Now, some of you know John and Judy Pex down in Eilat, and you know the shelter, and you also know Beit Chesda up in Haifa. Those two properties were owned by the Bethel mission to the Jewish people. That was started by Leon Rosenberg, who was working in Lodz in Poland. So here's what it says. The work of the Bethel mission in Lodz suffered terribly. Although Leon and Fanny Rosenberg survived, most of their close family who worked with them in Lodz were murdered. Fanny wrote to her husband Leon while he was still in the U.S. about all these things. He said, the tragedy that has befallen, he was doing deputation in the U.S., the tragedy which has fallen on the Bethel family cannot be described. Most of our missionaries in Lodz and other places, as well as those who belonged to the Bethel family, together with the children, were assassinated by the Nazis. Shortly later, Fanny wrote to her sister, Helena Wyman, who herself had left, and Mrs. Rosenberg, in writing this letter, and I'll stop here too, her sister said, 300 Hebrew Christians in Lodz were murdered. She herself survived, but members of her family and many relatives were all murdered. So this is what happened. But we don't end there. You can read that, and then I'm going to take one more slide. Are you getting the picture? Missions to the Jews died along with the Jewish population of Poland. The largest of the open and active fields of labor among the Jewish people for the sake of the gospel was now destroyed. And the war marked the end of a people and the end of an era. But it's not the end of the story. Glaser's little chart. So if you can see, we had the growth of the gospel throughout the 19th century. There was a book written by a French missionary to the Jewish people, Delaroy, and in his appendix he gives you all the numbers of Jewish people coming to Christ in the 19th century. That book was followed up in 1901 by a book by A.E. Thompson, who was a Christian Missionary Alliance missionary to Jerusalem. You can go to the graveyard, the Christian graveyard in the German colony, and you can go visit Thompson's grave. And he wrote in 1901 and copied from Delaroy and affirmed those figures from his perspective as well. Probably 200,000 or 300,000 Jewish people came to Christ in the 19th century that were recorded by the missionaries to the Jews. Could be more or less. Then between the wars, there was a movement of the Holy Spirit. And when you start reading the annals of Jewish missions, you will see that over and over and over again, you had holiday celebrations in Jewish areas like Warsaw, where there were 60 and 70 people, and then there were 200 and 300 and 400 people as you got closer and closer to 1939. It's almost as if God knew what would happen, which he did. And then, but this is not only true of CMJ, it was true of CPM, it was true of all the Jewish missions. All of us saw a movement of the Holy Spirit among Jewish people pre-Holocaust in Europe that was probably larger than the Jesus movement that we experienced in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. But it's unknown. And then the Jewish believers died with their fellow Jews. And the movement was not as good as dead, but shifted as the Jewish life shifted from Eastern Europe to the United States and then ultimately to Israel and, of course, to some degree, England and Canada and South America and so on. But the nexus of Jewish life switched from Eastern Europe to the United States and Europe and Israel eventually. And then rumblings came and God began working because he's a God who raises the dead. And he's faithful to his people. And lots of Jewish people got saved in the Jesus movement, like me and some of you. And that movement grew and it spread all around the globe. And then it eventually hit those Israelis that were traveling all over the globe after the army, and a bunch of them got saved, went home, and they started Hebrew-speaking congregations. And before you knew it, the Russians came along, got out of the former Soviet Union, and some would say that 60% of the body in Israel, up until a few years ago, spoke Russian as their first language. And God began moving in power, raising this Messianic movement from the dead. Today, before the war, as many of you know who do work there, we've seen what I would call a second generation movement of the Holy Spirit among the children of Israeli believers who grew up in Israeli schools, served in the army, and have stood firmly for the Lord. And so today, where are we? We might be running ahead of what happened between the wars in Europe. And it only took, 70 years. But we have a God who is faithful, who promised in Jeremiah that he would never allow the Jewish people to be destroyed, who promised that there would always be a remnant, may I quote the King James, according to the election of grace. God is the one who allows us to go through tragedy just like we're experiencing today. But never forget, the true never forget, is to never forget his promises, because he is a God who raises the dead. Selah. I have 5 minutes for easy questions.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Mitch. That was that's so insightful. I'm going to have to go back and listen to that like 2 or 3 times. That is so encouraging. All right, who has questions? Okay, we have one way in the back.
It's on. So I've been more familiar with Jews for Jesus. Actually, I went to Talbot. I had Dr. Talbot, Dr. Feinberg as well. Yeah, he came back to teach a little bit. But Jews for Jesus, I know, and often in their literature they ask for churches who will host them, but quite often they get a church that will host Jews for Jesus will often be designated as anti-Semitic because they don't want people proselytizing the Jews. So how do you try to convince Jewish people that you're not against them or that you're not anti-Semitic if you're trying to share the gospel with them? or even to invite Jews for Jesus to come and do a program at your church?
Yeah. Jewish people are what I would call pre-offended. Okay? And having been raised that way. And I was a hippie, non-religious, was raised in a more of an Orthodox Jewish religion. I never went to a non-Orthodox synagogue till I was already in seminary, actually. And so I had all those attitudes from my grandparents who were from Belarus and from Poland and so on, who were not believers. And so we don't ever take classes in Hebrew school on how to be upset with Christians or how to counter proselytism. Lord knows Feinberg went through his own struggles with his own parents, as did Anne, his wife, you know. But it's something that most Jewish believers go through, and it's nothing that we have done. The animosity between institutional Christianity and the Jewish people has existed for almost 2,000 years. And here's the good part about it. So what's the answer? Well, number one, I never respond to it. I could say, as a Jewish person, I'm pretty offended by what you're saying. How could you impute such impure, horrible motives to me? And if I'm trying to make people a non-Jew, then take a look at my daughters. They both had bat mitzvahs. They both love the Lord. They observe, they celebrate Passover and Hanukkah. I mean, prove it that we're not Jewish, But I don't say anything, because the only antidote is living a faithful life that demonstrates your heart and where you are. And it's one thing for a Jewish person who believes in Jesus to show that. It's another way for a Gentile, You're supposed to provoke Jewish people to jealousy with your love, and because you have a Jewish Messiah living in your heart. And I think if you just do that, that's an answer enough. And for those that want to, give us a hard time, just love them anyway, and love always wins. It's the number one strategy for reaching Jewish people. And I've lived next door to a Reform rabbi for the last 35 years. For the first 20, he never talked to us. I even shoveled the snow. But eventually, it's always the woman. So my wife befriended his wife. And now he says hi to me. But that's about it. So again, don't get discouraged by these things. Just love your Jewish friends and neighbors. And if you're a pastor and you get visited by the Anti-Defamation League, who says, you're inviting all these Jewish ministries to your church and you're anti-Semitic, just say, well, telling other people about Jesus is actually part of our faith. And if I was to leave Jews out, then I would be anti-Semitic. Then donate some money to the synagogue.
We got one in the back.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for this morning and for sharing what you shared. This has been on my mind for a while. If the Jewish people would have accepted Jesus as their Messiah, would they have gone through the Holocaust? They would accept
It is such a challenging question for me. I just don't know how to answer it because it's such a big if. I know it's a sincere question, but I don't really know how to answer it. I've been asked that before, and I thought about it, but I'm befuddled by it because there are theological elements to it, of course. Let's just put it this way, that once something happens, you know what God has allowed. Why he allowed it is a mystery. You know what I mean? So I wish I could give you a better answer, but I can't.
We'll know one day.
We will. Go easy on me, Randy. I have a chapter in your new book, in your book.
Well, an opinion question. So, what records do we have of German Christians in the military who had to deal with Jewish believers in, like, the Warsaw Ghetto or others?
Yeah.
Is there any record of response or clemency or any type of feelings toward them?
Yeah. Not that I've seen, but I have a lot of anecdotal experience. I'll give you one. So I preached at a Baptist church in Berlin, and the brother happens to be the chairman of our board in Germany. And I'm standing at the door, shaking hands, and one elderly man came up to me weeping. And he said, "I am so sorry." I said, what did you do? He said, "It's not me. It was my father. He was a Plymouth Brethren elder and lived right outside of, I forget which camp it was. It might have been Mauthausen or maybe Dachau." And he said, "And my father was coerced at gunpoint to getting the bodies of Jewish people out of the camp and burying them." And he said, "My father was such a committed Christian and believed in a future for Israel, because he was Plymouth Brethren. And he would sit every night. He went into a deep depression. He was just crying all the time. And so I'm asking for forgiveness on behalf of my father." And I was a little younger at that point, and I don't know if you've ever read it, but I didn't read Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book Life Together yet. And so I just said, "Well, I can't really, I can't really forgive you or your father, And I said, "But I know that God loves you, and I'm sure that God has forgiven your father," and so on. Then I read Life Together, and Bonhoeffer said, "Sometimes we just need to be one another's priests." And sometimes they just need to hear it from a person that they can see and just say, "I forgive you." And that's basically what Bonhoeffer said. So I started doing that, and it was a lot better. And I said, "You have God's forgiveness, and certainly you have my forgiveness." I mean, he was asking me to forgive him for what happened. It didn't matter that, so that's, and I've had about a half a dozen stories like that, Randall. So I don't know where it's written. I could find out maybe more. There are probably some books about it, I would imagine. But you've met the people. Yeah.
Actually, if I may, here.
Yes.
Hi. I listened to your presentation about your research in Poland years ago at the LCJE, and it motivated me as a Messianic Jewish German believer to do some research in Germany. There is a dissertation that was written about it by a lady in the 2000, I think it was 2005 or so. She did a lot of research on the topic, and I myself actually went to Berlin and found a Messianic Jewish congregation that still exists to this day. It's a beautiful building. I should say the building exists, not the congregation, but it's now, it has been bought by a PR firm. But I happened to be able to go inside, and I saw, she even brought the ark out, and there was this whole, the bima and writings in Hebrew, and it was absolutely beautiful. And I wrote an article for the area magazine about it because it moved me greatly. There were 700 people in that congregation, and there is a list of those who were brought into the concentration camps. We don't have documents of everyone, but I mean, just as in Poland, it was true for Germany as well, but not as much research has been done, and definitely it's worth looking into it. But there is a dissertation.
Yeah, thank you. So there you go. Ask a good question, and Christina's going to answer it. And that was a that church is still there. Yeah, I mean it's in eastern part of Germany. Technically it's in East Germany, isn't it?
You know what?
used to
That's
be.
such an interesting question. It's in Berlin now. It
Yeah,
could have
but
would
it
have would I think it would have been in the eastern
would have
part
been
of
in East
Yes,
Berlin.
that's true.
Yeah, there's a long history to that place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Sir, I studied under the great Arnold Fruchtenbaum, and I have a doctrinal question for you.
That's good because Arnold's right there.
Over and over in Scripture, we see, the remnant
Uh-huh.
is preserved, remnant in so many passages. And if I have a doctrinal grid, it bothers me a little that most of these people you're talking about, a much greater percentage, were Messianic Jewish believers. So, what if wax eloquent on what do you think about that?
Well, this is nerve-wracking because Arnold's, one of my mentors too. So, first Camp Shoshana, by the way. What are you looking for exactly?
The remnant was wiped out at a much greater percentage than the non-remnant, than non-Jewish believers in the Holocaust.
Okay.
The numbers bear that out, right?
Got it.
Okay.
Got it. Okay.
That wasn't a question either, but
No, but that was a good clarification. Okay. So I don't think that the Gentiles are part of the remnant. I think that's using a certain kind of theological and biblical nomenclature for that I would not use. I think that I believe in the unconditional nature of the Abrahamic covenant, and I do believe that Gentile believers have become enjoyed the rich fruit of the olive tree as well, which I think is the Abrahamic covenant in a spiritual sense. But I think that the remnant is limited to ethnic Israel who come to faith in Jesus. And so it is what it is. A lot of us died. Now, how many Gentile believers died? My guess is a lot more because they were soldiers. And my guess is that a lot of them died. And there were more of them. But I think there's a special category for those who were part of Romans 11:5. But like Tevye, sometimes I say, maybe next time choose somebody else.
I agree with you. Remnant is Jewish, not Gentile.
Well, then I know I'm right.
You don't transfer that to the church unless you're into replacement theology.
1 second. Was that okay, Arnold? Okay, good.
Okay. Nice. Gotta ask our Rebbe. Okay. Thank you very much, Mitch. And we will take our break now. One thing.